Good evening, Kenzi Riboulet-Zamouli. Thank you very much for being with us from Barcelona. You're an international cannabis activist, and you're also an independent scholar. Is that a fair description of you, you would say?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
And good evening.
Well, you've written recently and published about cannabis classification, and you're pointing out that there is a lot of inconsistency, and that as a consequence of these inconsistencies, there are distortion in the application of law. Could you perhaps explain to us why cannabis classification is inconsistent?
Well, I'm not sure I have the answer to why, but my guess is that because because cannabis has been prohibited for quite a long time now in many countries around the world. It's also been pushed away from public debate and also from research in some aspect. Or research has been oriented towards abuse or potential health harms, etc., etc. So we have maybe forgotten a bit about cannabis, and especially we've not been sharing knowledge. We've not been exchanging about what we know about cannabis. It's a very complex plant with a lot of products, some that can get you high, some that don't get you high at all, some that are used as food, clothes, and we don't have necessarily exchange between the communities that know about these different products, these different uses all around the world, and that use sometimes very different set of words, very different language to refer to the same plant. And sometimes also they use the same language to refer to different products of the same plant. So that brings a lot of confusion when in the 21st century, suddenly we start rethinking cannabis policies on a global scale, and we have to confront people from Nepal and from Jamaica and from Uruguay and from California and from Western Europe or whatever that don't necessarily have the same that struggle to understand each other because of these.
Sure, I think it would be really helpful if you provided us with some examples of inconsistencies or differences in meaning.
Maybe the best example is the word oil. We've been using the word oil to refer to a wide variety of products, all made from the cannabis plant, but very different. For me, oil is fatty oil, so it's like olive oil or this kind of oils. And we have one oil of this kind that is made out of the cannabis plant. It's what we sometimes called hemp seed oil. It's actually a fatty oil made from the seeds of the cannabis plant. And then we have in other regions or other groups of people that we call oil, a concentrate of the phytocannabinoid compounds, for instance, a THC-rich concentrate made for consumption for medical purposes, for instance. It's not technically an oil, it's not a fatty oil, but it has a consistency that looks a bit like oil, and a lot of people have started to refer to these extracts, to these products as cannabis oils. And in some instances, it's even passed into law, and we have some laws that regulate cannabis oils to refer to extracts, which is in terms of, which is scientifically incorrect and which might not be understood by all the person in the same manner.
Okay, thank you. So you're saying that the law is based on something, or that law has no scientific basis?
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
Fascinating.
We realized that when we were monitoring the WHO, trying to assess cannabis on this global scale a couple of years ago, and WHO had trouble understanding what they were assessing because of these problems in terminology, and even referring to what is supposed to be texts of reference as research is supposed to be, or law. We find inconsistencies like that, which are very problematic.
What do you make of the term marijuana, which is widely used in the United States, for instance?
Well, that's yet another kind of problems. Marijuana for some people is seen as offensive, as indeed it's been introduced in the United States at least as a political tool, a communication tool in politics, to associate the consumption of cannabis with certain population, in particular, Latin American people. But it's not necessarily seen with a negative connotation in Latin America, where it's a fairly common term to use to refer to the cannabis plant, and it's not at all seen as negative. In the US, it's seen extremely negative. In Europe, it might depend. I'd say that maybe in the UK, it has this negative sort of background because of the UK being quite close to US culture. In Spain, marijuana is also a fairly neutral word to refer to cannabis. And I'd say in French also, Marie-Jeanne is even maybe an old school, a bit kitsch term to refer to cannabis, but not at all negative in any way. So it really depends. It changes a lot with the stakeholder, with the person speaking. The social category of the person speaking, with time, what moment in time you're speaking, and with geography, of course. And with these three factors, we really have an impossibility to understand one another, depending on if you have two persons from different, social professional groups speaking, different countries, or at different ages.
Sure. I mean, connotations always change and they're context specific. But tell me, what do you make of the term hashish?
Hashish is a bit more complex. Originally, hashish refers to plant material, means plant, and now it's passed in at least Western European cultures to refer to again extracts of the cannabis plant, extracts of the trichomes of the cannabis plant, precisely what some people on the other side of the ocean in Northern America might refer to as oils. The term depends on. I mean, if we are talking from the point of view of the UK perspective, we have a vision of hashish as being concentrated resin extracted from the tops of the cannabis plant. That's not necessarily the meaning that is associated with hashish in Northern Africa, where the word comes from.
Okay, great. So it's good sometimes to trace words back to their etymological origin. But thank you. I mean, that's a good introduction. I think there's a lot of inconsistency. And what you're saying is that because of cannabis prohibition, our very research, our very scientific basis has been entirely distorted. And as you already said, much of the research has always been biased towards finding problems. It was always premised on the assumption of something problematic. And in a way, you could argue that it wasn't really science in the sense that it was not objective or value free. It started from a very definite position and sought confirmation of that position. But what I really wanted to ask you about now is, you mentioned it already, the WHO in their investigation or their assessment of cannabis came to the conclusion that cannabis needs to be reclassified. Can you perhaps tell me a little bit about the significance of this rescheduling?
Well, it's extremely significant. It's the most significant thing that happens in terms of international drug control of cannabis since 1991, when THC was already rescheduled and lowered in its scheduling. So in 1991, the United Nations, the WHO first, and then United Nations recognized that THC, the main active compound in cannabis, is less dangerous than what was previously thought. And last year, the same thing happened, but with the plant material of the cannabis plant. So that is the tops of the cannabis plant, the flowers and fruits, and this famous resin or extract or hashish or oil, depending on where and when you are located. It's extremely significant because although it looks like a small step to many, we have to understand that the WHO has a mandate that is very limited by the treaties. They could only do very limited set of steps, and they made the biggest steps that they were allowed to make, let's say. So they have done everything that was in their power to do. Going beyond would need taking action from governments, having governments amending, reforming the treaty, or bringing new interpretation of the treaties. But the WHO cannot make a revolution and cancel a treaty or wholly review a treaty, but they can reassess substances, reassess the harms linked with the substances, and maybe more importantly in this case, reassess the therapeutic uses and the potential in medicine of the different controlled substances, and that's what they did for cannabis. And by doing that, they recognize what everybody knows and what everybody has been knowing for a couple of thousand of years. That is that cannabis is indeed a medicine, but they also did something maybe more important. That is, they recognize the legitimacy of using cannabis in medicine and of researching it, of including it in the overall healthcare system, and that's something extremely significant for our decade.
Absolutely, yeah. And have you already, have you noticed any changes in national legislation and approaches to cannabis anywhere in the world so far?
Yes, we saw in Switzerland an initiative in Parliament that justifies that after these, bold steps taken by WHO and the United Nations, changes needed also to happen in the country, in Switzerland. In Morocco, the minister got convinced, he was not really convinced about changing cannabis laws at all, and he got convinced by this decision, by the fact that the international community reached not consensus but a majority at least to support this decision. And we've seen also other changes in the Caribbean islands and in a number of countries. We will see this decision having impact during the next 10 years. That's what is interesting.
Yes, I think the ripple will be slow at first, but it will certainly gather momentum. You already mentioned that this decision was taken by the World Health Organization, but you also mentioned the UN, and I think what you meant was the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is another UN commission that is responsible for deciding how drugs should be treated internationally in international legislation. There is a real difference of opinion in viewpoints between these two different UN bodies, the World Health Organization and the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Could you explain a little bit, perhaps, about the tension between these two?
Well, the United Nations as a whole is a bit functioning as a government would be functioning. And the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in this regard is somehow the parliament, at least on drug-related matters. The parliament of the United Nations is the General Assembly, but they delegate the decision to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. So it will be like in a parliament, it will be a sub-commission, a parliamentary commission on drugs, for instance. Mm-hmm. That's what the Commission on Narcotic Drugs is, while the WHO would be a governmental agency. So the executive branch versus the legislative branch, and that's I think the main difference in approach is to be seen there. But maybe most importantly, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs is composed by government representatives acting on behalf of their countries. They are ambassadors defending political position taken by politicians. WHO is obviously also a political body, but it is not directly composed on a daily basis in terms of operational functioning. It is not composed of members of persons representing their government. It's composed of persons acting in their personal capacity and acting on behalf of the organization with the purpose of protecting and enhancing health for everybody on the globe. So the approach is definitely here. The main motive for the Commission on Narcotic Drugs is the sum of the political agendas of the different governments, while the main motive for the WHO is global health.
No, thank you. That's a really good explanation of the relationship between the two. But just to press that point a bit further, my sense was that there wasn't that much enthusiasm or universal enthusiasm in the Commission on Narcotic Drugs about the WHO decision.
Yes, because it's a taboo topic, and it's a topic that it's it needed to be done. Cannabis and opium actually are the only two controlled substances, and I may add herbal traditional controlled substances that have never been that had never been assessed by the WHO or by the League of Nations before. So the fact that this had never taken place, and yet cannabis and opium have been placed at a high level of control for almost 100 years now, was problematic, and making the assessment was in a way already recognizing that we have been for 100 years controlling these substances without scientific justification. So the mere fact of WHO making that step was already problematic per se. It was also problematic because we know cannabis is the harms linked to the use of cannabis are extremely low, in particular when compared to many other substances that are controlled in international treaties. So the WHO having to recognize that not only the scheduling of cannabis was not based on science and too high, incorrect compared to its real harms and real therapeutic benefits, but in addition, the WHO is by doing this assessment, the WHO implicitly recognizes that the very framework of the treaty is not fit for controlling this kind of medicine. So it's a triple problem for the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And that's definitely what motivated the struggles. However, I think it's important to underline what little people have been remarking, but a lot of countries that have been strongly opposed to the WHO recommendations, passing into force, into international law, etc., including voting against, for instance, the Russian Federation. These countries have been really strong opponents to these WHO recommendations. Yet, in the process of opposing WHO, they have been obliged to agree with the conclusions of the expert committee of WHO that assessed cannabis. And these conclusions are the fact that cannabis is indeed useful in medicine and legitimate in medicine. So we have had maybe the first ever recognition by the Russian state of the usefulness of cannabis in medicine and the need to continue research and to provide access for patients. So that's what I remember of this whole process.
No, significant indeed, this decision, as you said, and it will cast, well, it will have a very long, will play out over a very long time. I wanted to talk to you about something else, because you've also looked into that whole area of intellectual property in relationship to cannabis strains. And there are a lot of different cannabis strains. And on the one hand, we have so-called cannabis breeders who come up with new strains, new combinations, new hybrids. And then we have something that is known as land races. And these are, I suppose, strains that have been cultivated by particular groups of people over a long period of times in different communities across the world. Perhaps you can tell me a bit more about how these traditional strains are protected under intellectual property law, or perhaps they aren't.
Yes, indeed, they aren't really protected. The problem with this whole issue is that it's very complex. It involves two blocks of intellectual property law. Let's say the classical one, which rather concerns the knowledge that communities have about the cannabis plant, how to grow it, how to process it, what medical uses can be made with this particular landrace, with this particular variety, what conditions. So this is one block of intellectual property law. Let's say it's the classical one, and then we have the specific, what we call plant variety protection rights. It's another kind of intellectual property law, but only for plants, because we know that the living is not subject to, or is not supposed to be subject to the exact same intellectual property law as inventions, human inventions, and plants are not supposed to be human inventions, except when they are bred, when there are specific varieties bred and obtained by the labor of breeders. And in this respect, we have a huge problem, which is not only a problem for cannabis, but for all plants, is that the system of plant variety protection is extremely how to say it is extremely Western-centric in a way that it does not, it favors, importantly, protection for individual breeders, so individual persons or companies, and not, it has no plans for collective rights, which would be needed for land races or for traditional cannabis plant varieties or other plants. And it has a set of criteria to allow for protection, which is very narrow and which does not correspond with land races. So it's basically the criteria are homogeneity and stability, in particular. The homogeneity and stability of the came over or the particular plant variety is something that does not exist in a natural environment. Land races are characterized by their diversity. It's a set of varieties that are very close one to the other. It's not a particularly stable variety per se, by opposition to the varieties that are bred, particularly in Western countries.
No, that's fascinating. How can we then protect it? I remember working in Jamaica a couple of years back, and there was real concern over the traditional strands like lamb's bread would be one of them, being displaced by imports from the Northern Hemisphere, which are not really well habituated to the environment there, but they have certain advantages. They grow faster and they're not as tall, which is something that was desired by illegal growers because they were less easily detected. But going beyond that, how can you protect traditional varieties?
So it depends what you mean by protecting. There is one thing that is protecting them in terms of conservation, keeping them existing in the environment and alive. And there is another thing which is providing protection for the people that have maintained, cultivated this generation over these strains, these varieties over generations, and should be entitled to protections, similarly to the way breeders are entitled to protection for their new plant varieties. Traditional communities should be entitled to protections for these varieties.
Sure.
How to do it? It's not a simple question because, as I told you before, it relies both on plant variety protection that are really not in favor of this kind of project, and intellectual property rights that are not necessarily always going in the right direction.
Are there other models that we can look at? If IP doesn't provide the answer, are there other ways of doing it?
Yes, there are new ways, in particular since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and the adoption of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and later on the Nagoya Protocol, which is a continuing in the same direction. We have a new system of it's not exactly intellectual property, but it's called it's access and benefit sharing. Yes, so the Nagoya Protocol introduced a system that is made for fair interactions between the people that provide genetic resources, so these land races, and the people that use the resources for research or for commercialization. And there is a full set of principles, and in particular the need for prior informed consent of the communities that provide the land races and the genetic resources, prior and informed consent on how the genetic resources, how the land race will be used, what will be done with it, how much money will be generated, where it will be sold, for how long, etc., etc. A real prior informed consent, which provides local communities, first of all, with the right to say no, which is a right recognized in general intellectual property law, in particular for indigenous people, local communities, traditional peasant communities, and then the right, the possibility to fairly negotiate um, uh, benefit sharing about benefit sharing on the products that are going to be developed based on these land races. When we say benefit sharing, it's obviously money, but it's also non-monetary benefit. It can be in-kind benefits. It can be also benefit in terms of intellectual property. If I want to use this Durban poison, which is what we could say a land race from Southern Africa, if I'm going to use this Durban poison and breed it to obtain a new variety and then sell this new variety to whoever, the local communities in Durban would have the choice to, decide maybe a percentage, royalties, maybe decide on the name. Maybe they don't want the name to be Durban or whatever. Decide on maybe being co-owners of the plant protection rights or the intellectual property rights developed, etc., etc. So there is this idea of prior informed consent, the fact that before taking the resource, the natural resource, you give full explanation of what is the business plan, basically based on this resource, to the people that provide the resource. This is what we call prior informed consent. This is what is captured in the Nagoya Protocol and in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that's really the best thing we have nowadays to protect, both to conserve, to provide, to contribute to the conservation of these varieties, and also to protect the people that have made these varieties possible.
A real collision in the making between the emerging commercial cannabis industry and this and communities seeking to protect their own intellectual property.
You know, it's we have a problem because cannabis is being regulated. The way in which cannabis is being legally regulated looks a lot like if it was regulated in the 1950s. I mean, we have a lot of issues that are crazy, from forced labor to this kind of total ignorance of biological diversity and these concerns that are absolutely critical. We can only have nowadays so many varieties, so many cannabis products, medicine, and compounds, cannabinoid compounds derived from these products. We can only have these available today thanks to the labor, the efforts of generation of small communities, victims of criminalization, victims of prohibition, and that beyond that have managed to maintain an ecosystem for these plants, an ecosystem that is not only an ecosystem of fauna and flora, but also an ecosystem with Homo sapiens sapiens, an ecosystem of knowledge, of skills associated with the plant. So all of the multi-million-dollar industry that is being built today would not have existed if prohibition had succeeded in eradicating these plants and eradicating the cultures that go with these plants. So the issue that I see now is that with extremely with some of the worst commercial practices, with some of the worst features of globalized capitalism, to say it shortly, taking place for the legally regulated cannabis, I fear that it might be worse for these communities and for these plants that have managed to survive prohibition than prohibition itself, which is unbelievable. But definitely there are tools that exist, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol in particular, and they must be enforced, they must be put into place, and first of all, they must be acknowledged by researchers, by NGOs, by the policymakers, of course, and obviously by local communities, indigenous people, traditional cannabis communities must know this tool and start to get ready to protect themselves from another kind of threat, which is that of legally regulated biopiracy in that case.
Biopiracy, very good term. Tell me, is there, if you cast your eye across the European Union, you've already mentioned Switzerland, which is not inside it, but let's say across Europe, are there any encouraging trends as far as you can see with regards to normalizing the status of cannabis from its current anomalous status?
Inside the European Union, in terms of land race or generally?
In general.
Well, I see a lot of what we call ground-up, bottom-up initiatives that are really positive, in particular cannabis social clubs and small-scale groups of users that are developing a lot of, in the end, new economic models for the supply and consumption of cannabis, which is really, really interesting, and I think really avant-garde in a way. But from the top down, I don't see a lot of constructive debates so far. We'll see. I mean, it takes time. There is debate, at least, which is something that is new. Before, it was not necessarily debated at all. Luxembourg has launched an initiative, but it was supposed to happen, and it didn't really happen, or what happened was quite deceiving. And I think that Luxembourg maybe was too too optimistic, and forgot that Luxembourg had two big neighbors that might not want to be that might want to be more consulted in the process. That's France and Germany, obviously. We've seen that in Germany there was an initiative in Parliament. In France, there is also an initiative in Parliament to discuss cannabis, but it's going slowly. We have elections coming on in the next year in Germany, in France. These are processes. I think the debate has been opened generally in the European Union, in Europe, including in the European Parliament, which is very good and quite new, honestly, that the debate is open at all. Now, the quality of the debate, it's another thing.
Now, finally, my last question is, as you know, this is a webinar hosted by the University of Kent, and our focus very much is on the UK, and most our speakers are from the UK. And I just wanted to ask you, in the wake of Brexit, are there opportunities for the UK to forge ahead in a new direction?
Well, yes. For instance, at least in terms of land races and plant variety protection and biodiversity, which is one of the things I'm working on right now, and one of the things where there is some room for maneuver, I think, in the good direction. Internationally, the UK remains a member of the same treaties as it was when it was part of the European Union. The only thing that changes is the registration of new plant varieties, which was before centralized in the CPVO, the Community Plant Variety Office of the European Union, and now passes to the Animal and Plant Health Agency or something like that in the UK. In this process, the CPVO, for instance, doesn't have any mechanism to check that if a breeder comes to protect a variety that it has been breeding, this variety has not been obtained through biopiracy. And I made a check, I have it here, I made a short research in the Community Plant Variety Office, and you have a bit more than 1,000 cannabis plant varieties registered, and there are some that are the fast Thai, Hawaiian Kush, Hindu Kush, Kerala, Mekong, Afghan, Swazi. A lot of new varieties. These are supposed to be new varieties to be protected. It has to be a new variety, but I'm not sure that the Hindu Kush is a new variety. It's a landrace that is extremely well known and that has probably a lot of years. So, in the process of moving away from the community plant variety office to this agency for animal and plant health, it would be interesting that the UK implement some mechanism of clearance to ensure that there is no new registration of varieties based on biopiracy. It's something that is very simple to do, possible to do. The UK is party to the Nagoya Protocol, so that's an opportunity maybe to show the way, and something that then the European Union could hopefully get inspired in.
Thank you very much, Kenzi. That's just what we wanted to hear. The European Union inspired by UK leadership. Very diplomatic and a great note on which to finish this interview. Thanks very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you.